today Lee Edwards. As you all know, Lee Edwards is the Distinguished Fellow of Conservative Thought at the Hoover, wrong institution, at the Heritage Foundation. And he's a leading historian of American conservatism, the author of 24 books, including biographies of Reagan, Goldwater, Buckley, General Meese, we're very pleased to have today, as well as histories of the Heritage Foundation and the American conservative movement. His latest book, written with Elizabeth Edwards Spaulding, is, and I love this title, A Brief History of the Cold War. With that, let me turn things over to Dr. Edwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, I would be delighted to be affiliated with Hoover. And if that's an offer of employment, let me talk a little bit later with you. That it's looking like I can be shifting back and forth, East Coast, West Coast, just like Mike Frank does. So here we are, this endlessly fascinating political figure, Ronald Reagan. Now, next to Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan is now, I'm told, the favorite subject of presidential historians, biographers, and just plain writers. There are currently an estimated 1,000 volumes about our 40th president. And they range from the comprehensive by such writers as Lou Cannon, Steve Hayward, W.H. Brands, to the particular by people like Thomas Evans, Mark Elliott, and Douglas Brinkley, the historian. Now, the latter author draws our attention to what they argue are the keys to understanding Reagan. Sometimes it's the General Electric years, sometimes the Hollywood years, or in Brinkley's case, it's a single speech, just one speech, the one that Reagan gave at Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, France, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1944. So many books about this fascinating yet, to some, elusive political leader, and so little time in which to read them. And then along comes a new book by an historian who has uncovered mirabile dictu, to quote Bill Buckley's favorite phrase, something hitherto unknown and unreported. The mentor-mentee relationship between Dwight David Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. Now, guys like me, we're supposed to be, historians, we're supposed to be indefatigable researchers and we just totally miss this relationship between these two men. And this gentleman to my right done it. So in this marvelous book, Reagan's 1968 Dress Rehearsal. Now, it's a big book, so you ain't going to dash it off in just an evening or so, but it's really worth digging into. Gene Kopelson argues convincingly that Reagan's 1968 presidential bid was in fact a dress rehearsal for his 1968 attempt. And even before his election as governor of California in 1966, there was a particular senior Republican who had his eye on Reagan, and that person was Dwight David Eisenhower, who engaged in an extensive and admiring correspondence with the governor. He counseled candidate Reagan on for example, how to fight charges of anti-Semitism. And he even, and I love this, he even critiqued Reagan's speaking style. So maybe we can get particularly Gene to get into what Eisenhower said about Reagan's speaking style. Reagan paid special attention to Eisenhower's advice in the field of foreign affairs, understandably. And Dr. Kopelson argues that Reagan, quote, saw Vietnam through the lens of Eisenhower and Korea. And in pursuit of Ronald Reagan, Gene Kopelson went where no historian had gone before, digging deep into the Eisenhower-Reagan correspondence and files where, at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, now the rest of us went to the Reagan Library, but Gene had enough brains to say, well, let's go to the other end of it, and let me go to the one at the Eisenhower Library. And he also, in part of that, at the Reagan Library, went to the 67-68 Reagan gubernatorial audio tape collection. Now, can you imagine anything more exciting than sitting there and listening to hour after hour of audio tapes, even with Reagan's wonderful mellifluous voice? But Gene Kopelson did it. And not content with his revelations about Eisenhower, Dr. Kopelson also discusses the contentious relationship between Robert Kennedy and Reagan, who believes that then Attorney General Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, coerced General Electric into canceling Reagan's TV program in 1962, and then arranged for the IRS to audit 10 years of Reagan's tax returns. And Fred, there's a subject for you to dig into and see whether that truly is the case or not. There is so much to read and admire in Gene Kopelson's big book, Reagan's 1968 Dress Rehearsal. It's a work of scrupulous scholarship, lively writing by an historian who has also published widely about Theodore Roosevelt, the Holocaust, and the politics of Washington State and the Northwest, where he has resided for many years. Dr. Kopelson is a graduate of Princeton and Columbia University, where he did his medical studies. He completed his internship and residency at Harvard University's Department of Radiation Oncology at the Massachusetts General Hospital. But we're here today to listen and to learn about this marvelous relationship between these two men and also other fascinating insights into Ronald Reagan. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming what I think we can call an outstanding citizen historian writing about a citizen politician and candidate, Gene Kopelson.
One little bit of electronic housekeeping first. Thank you all very, very much for taking time out of your busy work week. I want to thank people here from the Hoover Institution, Paige Mathis, Mike Frank, Jennifer Mayfield, Adam, as well as Matt, and from the Heritage Foundation, and for that beautiful introduction, Lee Edwards. Let me apologize, my time is limited here today. I have to go through some of my initial material very, very quickly. If you're fans of C-SPAN, I was televised the other evening. It's there in some more detail, but of course all the specifics are in my book. And the audio clips that you're going to hear today are some 50 years old. But today I hope you view as a special treat. You're amongst the very first to hear the voice of Ronald Reagan, who of course you know from the 1980s so well, but you're going to hear him speak about the late 1960s, a time period very, very similar to today. But back to the 1980s, the age of Ronald Reagan to me was a golden age for America and for the world. I set out about trying to find out why he first ran for the presidency in the late 1960s. And rightly so, you could say, what possibly could Dwight Eisenhower have to do with Ronald Reagan? After all, Reagan is elected in 80. Doesn't Ike just spend the 60s on the golf course, become ill, and pass away? Well, it was during my research that Lee mentioned at the Eisenhower and Reagan presidential libraries that I found out that Ronald Reagan viewed Dwight Eisenhower and his presidency in the 50s as America's golden age. As you're about to learn, two quite fitting examples of the legacy of President Dwight Eisenhower are the governorship and presidency of Ronald Reagan. My purpose today is to pique your interest by showing you just a few very selected highlights of what I have found. I'm not going to be talking in any detail about the '68 campaign per se, nor am I going to discuss at all Robert Kennedy. That's for another time. Let's begin. This is the basis of my research. I went after the Reagan files at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, which consists of memos, telegrams, and letters. I interviewed across the country 35 aides and activists who were Reagan's 1968 campaign grassroots activists and his hired campaign team. There were 4 personal meetings between Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. And as Lee mentioned, I listened many, many tens of hours to the audio tapes of when he traveled out of state from 66 through 68, he left California almost every weekend, seeking delegates for the 68 convention, seeking financial support, and setting up his offices. And those speeches, many of which were the same speech over and over, I listened to because as time went on it changed, but much more critically were the press conferences he held. Reporters asked him about Vietnam, other areas of foreign affairs, and that showed to me the relationship and influence of Dwight Eisenhower. I also examined Ike's post-presidential diary in Abilene at the Presidential Library. Very few historians have looked at that at all. And we're going to hear their own words reflecting about the late 1960s. Just as one example, in Gettysburg, where the Eisenhowers summered, Mamie made every single person, including her kids and grandchildren, sign in and out a logbook that she kept. And here's Ronald Reagan, the first time visiting Dwight Eisenhower in person, June 15th of 1966. They met several times and spent many hours together on the golf course. They did golf, but they spent many, many hours, and you're going to hear some of those recollections shortly. Briefly, their beginning interactions, it started in 1944 during the war bonds appeal for World War II. They cut a joint publicity record, Let's All Back the Attack. They were not together in the same studio, but that's their first true interaction. Let me review that in the early 50s, Ronald Reagan, in his autobiographies, says that he was very unhappy with Truman's handling of the Korean War and the slow buildup of troops. He was also very unhappy with the continued growth in the massive federal bureaucracy begun under FDR. He telegrammed Dwight Eisenhower urging him to run for president. And when he discovered, as did much of the rest of the country, that Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, Reagan at the time being a Democrat, he reasoned, if I thought he was the best man for the job, then I'm going to vote for him as a Republican. And Ronald Reagan became a Democrat for Ike. During the Eisenhower presidential years, I just want to review a few brief points. He, of course, famously said he will go to Korea, and he ended the fighting with one important method was via threatening to use atomic weapons. In 1953 at the United Nations, he delivered a speech called Atoms for Peace. He proposed the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons on the planet, which of course at that time were mainly American, under the aegis of a United Nations authority. But there was one caveat, that the Soviet Union had to agree. They refused, and the buildups on both sides continued. Also, you may recall the islands close to Taiwan, or Formosa, Quemoy and Matsu. They were threatened by Red China during the 50s, and Eisenhower said he sent the 7th Fleet there. They're going to have to crawl over them. Please, in my book, you'll read more about a 1950s film, a long-forgotten film that Ronald Reagan made called Prisoners of War. He was an actor, and the theme of the movie was he goes as an Army officer to a Korean POW camp and sees the horrible conditions that American troops were facing. By 1962, when Nixon was running for the governorship of California, Ronald Reagan becomes a Republican. And that same year, Eisenhower hosted a GOP meeting at his home in Gettysburg to improve GOP marketing, which Eisenhower felt had been done quite poorly. And they came up with a publicity record called Mr. Lincoln's Party Today that we'll review in a second. Also, though, 2 years later, in 1964, at the San Francisco Convention, where Barry Goldwater is nominated, the liberal writer Gore Vidal is very close to Nancy and Reagan and Ronald Reagan, who are keenly observing Dwight Eisenhower. And my book will get into more detail of that. But he was observing Dwight Eisenhower then. This is that publicity record from '62 that I mentioned. And you're going to see these 5 familiar faces. There's Ike in the upper left, Richard Nixon, liberal governor of New York, Republican Nelson Rockefeller, conservative Barry Goldwater, and there's the brand new Republican who's chosen to be the narrator of this GOP record, Ronald Reagan. The script for this record is in the archives of the Eisenhower Library, and handwritten in, Dwight Eisenhower made some corrections to that script. He wrote in these words: "Good Republicans can have divergent political beliefs. There are good conservative and liberal and middle-of-the-road Republicans." He was saying that Republicans have a wide political tent. And also, having brand new conservative Republican Ronald Reagan as the narrator of this record was perfectly fine with Dwight Eisenhower. Here is the very briefest of excerpts when Reagan introduces him on this record.
And now we hear from one who has served his country all of his adult life, crowning that service with 2 terms as President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Well, they speak about individual freedom and small government, and that the GOP has a wide political tent. Now we're going to go forward into the future to that Goldwater campaign a week before the big Johnson landslide victory. You all are familiar with Reagan's A Time for Choosing, the speech that it became known as. One sentence that I'd like to just remind you that Reagan said, he castigated the West, that the West, we never open up our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in Soviet colonies. You know the speech well, how his group of Los Angeles financial backers, sometimes called the Los Angeles Elders, or his kitchen cabinet, decide that he should run for office. Well, also a group from Michigan forms the actual very first Reagan for President Club. But across the country, as my book will reveal, some of you in this audience were watching that also, and that started some of you on that track to being conservative Republicans and supporters of Reagan that night. But there was one other person sitting at home on his TV watching Reagan deliver the speech as well, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. He immediately calls his former Attorney General and says, "What a fine speech Ronald Reagan just delivered." He then calls his former special assistant and says again, "What an excellent speech Ronald Reagan, the newcomer, just delivered." But there was an intermediary between the two, and that was a mutual golf buddy, Freeman Gosden. He had been the co-creator and co-star of radio's Amos and Andy. David Eisenhower, Ike's grandson, recalled the Gosdens as amongst the most treasured friends that the Eisenhowers had, and he became the critical intermediary between them in the summer of '65. On July 14th, Gosden phoned Ike saying, "You know, there's a new political person. He's an actor. You probably know of him. He's thinking of entering politics. What can you advise him to do?" So this is not Ronald Reagan just blindly following what these financial backers tell him to do, as has been portrayed. He wanted the advice of a mentor, someone who was an established, well-known politician, and he goes right to the top. He asks Gosden to speak to Ike. Eisenhower picks up the pen, writes immediately a multi-step plan for Reagan to follow. And Reagan not only will follow Ike's advice to the letter, when he announces to the state of California in January of '66 that he's going to seek the governorship, in those exact words of that speech, he actually copies some of this advice that Eisenhower gives him. Eisenhower's plan, number one, Reagan should make an unequivocal statement that he is a Republican, that in '64 he honorably supported the party, and that the GOP, in seeking common sense solutions, can accommodate men who differ sharply on detail. Please, I emphasize those words, common sense, for a reason. But again, Ike used it. Never cease, Ronald Reagan, to present yourself as a Republican seeking the support of all, to bring common sense and integrity to government. You should define your political convictions, keep hammering away at them whenever you can, and reach out to the media. Ronald Reagan follows Ike's advice to the letter. Their correspondence and phone calls is detailed in my book. I cannot get into any of these specifics, so I summarize them here. As I mentioned, he used Ike's exact words when he announces he's running for governor. He made that term common sense, of course, originally from Thomas Paine, but you'll hear later in my talk, Reagan will thank Dwight for it. That became his campaign theme. In '52, Ike was the citizen soldier. Reagan in '66 was the citizen politician, and in '68, during his first quest for the presidency, he would make a campaign film called Ronald Reagan, Citizen Governor. Eisenhower wrote that he had studied Reagan. He did not view him as an extremist. He advised Reagan many different times. He advised him on polling. He advised Reagan to emphasize Northern California in the gubernatorial campaign. He advised him to bring in the supporters of his primary opponent, the former mayor of San Francisco, and twice advised him on how to fight false charges that Reagan was an anti-Semite. And as mentioned by Lee, he actually mentored Reagan on speech delivery. This is Reagan, the actor and public speaker. And Reagan thanked him for giving him his time and advice. Seeking out independents and Democrats, Eisenhower suggested a number of times, and I believe this is the actual true source of Reagan Democrats. Eisenhower publicly endorses Reagan. He donates financially as well as his time to that '66 campaign. The mentor and the student, the coach and the student, they each had to be comfortable in that kind of relationship. Here is Ike as a football player on the left. Here is Ronald Reagan as a football player on the right. They each knew that there had to be a teacher and a student, the older, the younger, and that teamwork to win victories either on the football team or at the ballot box were critically important. This was Eisenhower's mentor when he served in Panama, General Fox Connor, and I think Eisenhower began to see himself as continuing that legacy to Reagan, but now he was in the role of mentor. Ronald Reagan, as you know, wins the governorship by almost 1 million votes. This is Eisenhower's telegram of congratulations to Ronald Reagan. 2.5 weeks after Ronald Reagan becomes governor-elect, Dwight Eisenhower proposes to the GOP leadership that he was going to host a luncheon for all prospective 1968 GOP candidates for the presidency. And he sends the GOP this list that he wrote in this order: Nixon, Romney, Percy from Illinois, Reagan, which I emphasize, Rockefeller, and Oregon's Mark Hatfield. In effect, Dwight Eisenhower had mentored Ronald Reagan from being a novice entering politics now into a potential president of the United States. And what did Ike actually think of seeing Ronald Reagan in the White House at some point? In June of '66, right after their first meeting, the press admitted that he certified Ronald Reagan as presidential timber. 9 months later, at another meeting, he tells the press that if Ronald Reagan is the GOP nominee in the summer of '68, for sure, he will enthusiastically endorse him for president. No questions at all. And then after that, he actually sends a memo that he urged Ronald Reagan to run as California favorite son, which was Reagan's plan all along. Reagan was also thought of as being paired with Nelson Rockefeller for the vice presidency. Ike did not think this was a good idea. This was regarded by Ike as a marriage of political convenience. Eisenhower was never asked, what do you think of a ticket headed by Ronald Reagan? But we're now going to bring up something from much older. General William Tecumseh Sherman, as you may recall, said in the late 1880s, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. Well, this is something that the press very, very frequently, during his first quest for the presidency, asked Ronald Reagan, well, would you accept the vice presidency? What would you do about General Sherman? Listen now to Ronald Reagan's answer, and the point is not what he actually answers about Sherman, but about who he discussed this with.
The question of this gets down to the Sherman statement, and would someone make the Sherman statement? Well, I like to remember what former President Eisenhower said to me one day on the golf course about the Sherman statement. He said it's a booty statement that even Sherman shows with many.
Again, it's not the Sherman statement, it's the two of them discussed the vice presidency on the golf course, and obviously the presidency as well. We're now going to move on a little bit. I know you're going to have a symposium soon about firing line. Well, we're going to look at listen to one specific program in October of '67. William F. Buckley, the conservative, has as his guest the conservative Republican governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And he starts to ask, as you will hear in a second, questions of Ronald Reagan, castigating Ike for not dismantling FDR's New Deal. And I think William F. Buckley expected Ronald Reagan to agree with him and start to attack Dwight Eisenhower. But listen how immediately Ronald Reagan comes to the defense of his mentor.
Mr. Eisenhower's difficulty when he became president? Oh, yes. I think the very fact that, and this is overlooked a great deal with him, the very fact that one of his most notable achievements, he vetoed 165 spending measures in his term in office.
This was also enormously increased the price of government. Would you say that was the inertia of the preceding 20 years of the New Deal? And 8 years is not a sufficient long period to start and change that trend, or simply that he had insufficient energy or conviction to change that trend, or to prefer the third alternative, that he only towards the end of his 8 years in office began to see the necessity of that trend.
Well, no, I'd add something else in there. But only one term of his entire 8 years did he have a Congress of his own philosophy and his own party. He was a president isolated by a Democratic Congress that was carrying on literally the philosophy that had been in existence since 1932. And as I say, the greatest thing that he could do was in those numerous vetoes when he had the power to keep them from getting the two-thirds majority necessary to demolish.
Now we're going to switch gears and talk about foreign affairs. You're going to hear mention a few things about the Kennedy years, Laos, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis in passing, but I want to concentrate a little more basically on Vietnam. Behind the scenes, after and somewhat before Lyndon Johnson sends American boots on the ground, he had asked Dwight Eisenhower to be his hidden military advisor, and Ike had made many meetings with Johnson, and he urged Johnson, as occurred for D-Day under Ike's stewardship, to have a massive show of force to win quickly in Vietnam. Johnson didn't listen, and the Vietnam quagmire began. Ike urged that the Haiphong Harbor be mined. He had a committee in 1967 to make military recommendations. He wanted hot pursuit, that is, when enemy troops and aircraft go over a border, to go after them. He didn't want American bombers to stop bombing the North. He wanted to threaten to use atomic weapons. He didn't say if he'd use them, he wanted the threat. He also wanted the American Navy to threaten an amphibious invasion. He also wanted to bomb the dams in the North. Of all the candidates in '68, it was only Ronald Reagan who spoke those exact same goals, and he learned this all from his mentor Eisenhower from their very first meeting in June of '66 onwards. Now we're going to listen as Ronald Reagan, what he's learned from Eisenhower about Vietnam and about much more, such as standing firm against communism. Remember, this is the voice you know so well from the late 70s and 80s, but now you're going to hear him. You've never heard him before talk about the 60s. After that letter was going to be sent by Eisenhower to the GOP leadership in December of '66, he sends this letter to to Reagan, I do hope that sometime during the winter I can get a chance to talk with you more about world affairs, continuing their discussions. Ronald Reagan says about atomic weapons, I still repeat what Ike said some time ago. One of our greatest mistakes in Vietnam was in assuring the enemy in advance of our intention not to use them. Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower wanted the enemy quaking in their beds every night, wondering what America would do next. In January of '66 were the two major shocks. The Tet Offensive. Well, I think you polled Americans, the very few who would even recall that term probably would recall that it was some kind of major military disaster for America. Well, that's how it was portrayed in the media, especially by CBS's Walter Cronkite, that this was a tremendous defeat, and it handed the communists, this kind of coverage, a tremendous victory. But it was actually the reverse. It was a major military victory for South Vietnam and for America. Well, a couple of weeks after, the USS Pueblo in international waters, it was an intelligence ship, is hijacked by North Korea. So North Korea sticks its hand into the scenes in the middle of the Vietnam War. The crew was imprisoned and tortured. President Johnson seemed paralyzed with indecision. There was no public response. Please listen now to Ronald Reagan discussing the USS Pueblo. Also, at that time, John F. Kennedy had changed America's overall strategy. Eisenhower wanted massive retaliation. JFK wanted something different. He wanted flexible response, to be able to respond short term. Well, the Pueblo was one such incident where this was going to be put to the test. Listen to Reagan and his discussions.
This play had a 7-year run, beginning with the Bay of Pigs and closing with the humiliating theft of one of our ships and the kidnapping of 83 young Americans. The official explanation given for the inability for our air forces in the Far East to move out and support the Pueblo is that all the fighters on alert in Korea are equipped only for nuclear retaliation. Hasn't that been the most persistent claim of this administration? Hasn't their claim been that we have moved at a cost of $500 billion over these last few years from a nuclear footing to one that would avoid the threat of the bomb and give us a flexible response? And now when a response is needed, we had no response at all.
Similarly, I'd like you now to listen to Reagan's use of a certain word. Remember back to Korea, he had been changing to a Republican because he was upset with President Truman's slow buildup of troops in Korea. Now the same thing had happened in Vietnam. Ike had urged massive buildup. Johnson had not listened. But there had been that slow troop buildup now in the past, and Reagan is going to comment on it. But he's going to lament the lack of a surge. We would not hear that term again until the Iraq War and General Petraeus. But listen to Ronald Reagan use that word 45 years earlier.
Without exception, military leaders, and particularly this great galaxy of leaders of World War II, from General Trudeau and Bradley, and General Eisenhower, without exception have spoken of stopping the entrance of supplies and rifle at Peru. Number two, they all seem agreed on either the necessity to invade or at least to pose constantly the threat of invasion, to pin down an enemy force that's got a statement and got at his door. You know, any argument about escalation is a specious argument. We've had escalation. My disagreement with the administration is militarily. It's the same escalation that it took us 2 years to get to. If we'd had it at the time the military was recommending it as a sudden surge and thrust of power, the war could well be overwhelmed.
And this is Ronald Reagan, not in the 80s, discussing world affairs in the late 60s. Well, now mentioned by Lee earlier was the lens of Ike and Korea. That's the term I use. But listen directly, Reagan's words on this exact subject. He's going to start out discussing peace negotiations, but take it beyond that.
My statements last week about what should be done at the negotiating table were in reality quoting some earlier remarks by former President Eisenhower. The effect that when you sit down to negotiate with the communists, we should keep in mind the 2 years of negotiations in Korea, in which during that period of time, more than 20,000 Americans were killed. And I think you have to recall President Eisenhower, coming in as a new president toward the end of that 2-year period, brought an end to the negotiations and the settlement of the conflict by simply releasing the word that the United States was going to review its options with regard to weapons, theaters of operation, manner of fighting, and so forth. I've said the same thing I believe should be true in these Paris negotiations. If at a given time we should let the enemy know that they have shown no evidence of a sincere desire of selfless conflict to bring peace, that they are procrastinating, using the negotiations to gain what they couldn't gain in the battle, then we must be prepared to threaten them with force. And I would think that the same conditions that President Eisenhower submitted would be the conditions here. A review of our strategy, review of targets, a review of theaters of operation, meaning whether we're going to continue to fight this war and destroy the cities of South Vietnam or fight this war on their own soil. The first 2 weeks of these negotiations, the death rate for Americans in combat has gone up and set new records for this entire long war. Well, the ideal, if such a thing should come about, would be a South Vietnamese invasion supported logistically by the United States. Whatever is required, if that should be done. In the meantime, that the enemy should see preparation, that if the enemy must believe and must see that you are willing to, that you are amassing the landing craft, the weapons, mobilizing the forces that are going to result in invasion.
Reagan and Eisenhower wanted the American Navy off the coast of North Vietnam, threatening to invade, so that the troops of the North would have to pull back and guard their homeland. This is what Reagan said that spring, now into '68. Things were different during Ike's time. Twice during the time Ike directed things, menacing Soviet movements against Berlin were disposed of without the call-up of a single reinforcement, just by Ike's strong show of force. And now we're going to hear a little bit of candidate Reagan's most scathing attack on the Kennedy-Johnson years. You're going to hear him mention at the very, very beginning the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I get into a lot of detail on this because I think this is one of the bases of SDI, Star Wars, but that's not the subject. We're going to listen to his overall foreign affairs talk. Listen to one other quote. At the end, he's going to say, pull his chestnuts out of the fire. When Truman called Eisenhower out of being the president of Columbia University to head NATO, he was very annoyed. He said, I got to rescue Truman's chestnuts out of the fire. Reagan repeats that phrase. I believe only would he have gotten that directly from Ike during one of their chats. So please listen.
Where did we take a different course? In recent days, there's been smiles in the Kremlin. They've been warm and friendly. But I wonder if they're smiling or if they're laughing at us. We're now ready to talk a nuclear weapon treaty that will stop us from protecting our cities, as theirs are already protected by an anti-ballistic missile program. Russian rockets are killing our young men and raining down on the innocent civilians of Saigon. But our national leaders indicate that they believe we can enter into a treaty, in spite of the fact that this other nation has already broken more than 50 treaties with this country and has indicated that it believes it is its right to break a treaty anytime it suits its national purpose. Lenin said to tie one's hands in advance and to openly tell an enemy who is presently armed that we will fight him and win is stupidity. The Great Society has made a big point of its supposed freshness of outlook, its zest for innovation and its gift for invention. The truth is, the Great Society has brought forth little that is great and nothing that is new. Practically all of the truly commanding weapon systems now in American inventory were developed or brought forward during the Eisenhower years. The ballistic rockets with their numerous variations. The development driven to completion by a brilliant young missile man of a new breed, General Bernard Schreiber. Of the miniaturized thermonuclear warhead made possible by the inventive genius of Dr. Edward Teller. The supersonic jet strike force conceived and made operable by General Curtis LeMay, the father of the Strategic Air Command and one of the greatest air geniuses of all times. The entire Polaris concept, coupling missile and weapon technology with a nuclear submarine, born of Admiral Hyman Rickover's persistence. But where are these men with their drive and determination now? Having pulled America's chestnuts out of the fire in the 50s, what do they have to say about American technology in this decade?
Reagan, of course, was not glorifying war. He was pointing out all the achievements of Eisenhower had not been carried forth, and the Soviet Union was catching up. And at the beginning of that, you could almost hear him call the Soviet Union the evil empire. Not yet quite. Only at one point did Reagan publicly acknowledge the debt he owed to Dwight Eisenhower. Only this minuscule fragment. Listen as a reporter asks Reagan if Eisenhower's use of the term common sense might make a good campaign theme. And he now reflects back on what happened 2 years earlier.
On this question a while ago, I liked General Eisenhower when he said we were known as the party of common sense. He thinks that would be a great slogan.
Well, I tell you, I used it as a slogan in a campaign in California a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and I agree with it. Matter of fact, he was the inspiration for it.
He was the inspiration for it. That is the direct link of that common sense usage traced back to Eisenhower's using it twice in that first letter of advice, and now finally in public said so by Reagan. Of course, Reagan would use that term many other times in the future, as detailed in my book. Right before the Miami Beach Convention, Reagan reflects back on the 50s. There was no missile gap. Our national security was not in danger under Ike. Today it is. Our land wasn't torn by riots and insurrection. Today it is. And President Reagan really was there all along in the late 60s. I've only touched upon a few points. Please go over it when you look over my book. Multiple times he advocated for freedom for Eastern Europe. You'll read about his Croatian proclamation. He didn't first call in the mid-60s to tear down the Berlin Wall. It was May 15th, 1967, when he debated Bobby Kennedy, that in public for the first time he called to tear down the Berlin Wall. And he did it multiple other times during that first campaign for the presidency. As you heard a little bit, and I traced that history back even further, SDI, in my opinion, began then. Clearly, he warned the Soviets they cannot match a strong American economy and a strong military. He did not want America to be neutral in the Middle East. He wanted us to take a firm, strong stance with Israel. He didn't like going to the UN to seek geopolitical solutions. He also discussed how to deal with hostage crises. On the domestic front, many times he said people should have equality at life's beginning, but not guaranteed equal results. He also adhered firmly to the 11th commandment of not speaking ill of other Republicans, and he said many times, no matter who that candidate in '68 would be, Rocky, Nixon, Romney, he would firmly support them. Now we're going to go ahead with the briefest of samplings of the continuing influence of Dwight Eisenhower throughout the Reagan presidency. In '75, after he was governor, but before he ran for the second time, let alone the third time, he said, Ike ended a war in Korea that had killed tens of thousands of our youngsters, and after that, no Americans were being shot. He also halted dead in its track the advance of communism. Big government didn't get any bigger. Never had America's wealth been so widely distributed. Never were we so strong. In 1978, he's running for the third time for president. One of the issues at that time was whether or not the Panama Canal should be turned back to Panama. Reagan was not in favor of that, and I'd like you to listen during a debate that he had when he cites a discussion he had with Dwight Eisenhower on that subject. So what I want you to get from this is their discussions on world affairs in the golf course and in the golf carts were far and wide-ranging. Listen to Ronald Reagan.
But I also know that a president you didn't mention who first was engaged in the problems in Panama, President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower told me of the idea that he had for the treaties that was far different from anything that is contained in these treaties. As a matter of fact, he was toying with a very interesting idea of forming an international corporation of shipping nations, all the nations of the world, a quasi-corporation to own both the Suez and the Panama Canal, and thus with all participating and all using those canals, there would be no possibility of one jumping the traces. He told me that in the golf cart, which was a pretty good place to hear it.
And again, it's just another example of their multiple discussions. I'd like to thank Bruce Weinrod, who pointed this particular thing out to me. During the campaign for the presidency in 1980, Ronald Reagan is asked by a reporter, well, candidate Reagan, who's your favorite president? He says to the reporter, well, you know, I can't really choose one, and the obvious choices are Washington and Lincoln. But he immediately turns the conversation to Dwight Eisenhower. He says, you know, Ike was a darn good manager. Those were the last really prosperous years we've had, and there was peace in the world. He then told the reporter the forgotten firm stance of Eisenhower and Quemoy and Matsu. He told the reporter, Ike said they'll have to climb over the 7th Fleet. Well, you know what? Nobody tried to. There was no war because of Ike's firm resolution, and to this day, Quemoy and Matsu remain free. Clearly to me, Eisenhower was Reagan's hero. Michael Deaver recalled there was a photo of Ike and Reagan together in every office that Reagan had. There was a photo of Ike behind Reagan's Oval Office desk. There was a bust in Reagan's private study, and a towering portrait of Eisenhower hung in the cabinet room. Reagan here, looking at some of his speech index cards, he quoted Eisenhower very frequently. Peace through strength, Eisenhower's exact words, the vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Well, other historians specifically mentioned, Doug Brinkley and others well before me, have felt that it was FDR who was Reagan's role model that he tried to emulate. Well, I went into the search engine and at the Reagan Library and tried to learn who did he actually cite in all of his known speeches, press conferences, public discussions. Not mentioned here, I'm going to use as a baseline Lincoln. He cited, during those 8 years he was president, Lincoln approximately 100 times. He only cited FDR 56 times. He has always looked to Coolidge, but Coolidge he only cited 24 times. The person he cited the very, very most by far was Dwight Eisenhower, 178 times. Well, now we're going to move to December 8th, 1983. This is exactly the 30th anniversary of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech at the UN. At this exact date, President Reagan is having discussions with Andropov. This was before Gorbachev, with Andropov, who that day canceled the ongoing arms reduction talks. Reagan walks out of the meeting disappointed, speaks to the press, and he reflects back to Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech and says to the reporters, my administration endorses Ike's view completely. This is what we are dedicated to doing. So President Reagan made achieving President Eisenhower's goals from that Atoms for Peace speech his own official policy. D-Day, June 6, 1984. Lee mentioned it earlier. Reagan becomes the first president to actually go to Normandy. He speaks on the land commemorating Ike's troops. He says, "I will forever stand for Ike's D-Day veterans. They are my heroes like they were his." Well, offshore of Normandy, we have a ship there, the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, which sails past Normandy, and her aircraft fly over President Reagan delivering his speech. After the speech, Reagan goes by helicopter over the USS Dwight Eisenhower. The crew forms these letters, IKE. Reagan says, "The D-Day landing was the heroic operation planned and commanded by Ike. The memory of Ike, our great Allied leader, still inspires heroic efforts on both sides of the Atlantic." But as he watches and the crew makes that symbol, that formation, he grabs the mic and adds, "I like Ike, I love Ike." We're almost done. I'd now like you to listen to President Reagan's 1989 farewell address that many of you have probably listened to. At the end, he asks people to study history. Well, listen to these words as he reflects back on why he entered politics in the 60s, his use of citizen politician common sense, and how at the end of his own presidency, he still manages somehow to honor Ike's troops at D-Day, Korea, Anzio, and other places. Listen to President Reagan reflect back.
They called it the Reagan Revolution. I'll accept that. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. Common sense told us that when you put a big tax on something, the people will produce less of it. So we cut the people's tax rates, and the people produced more than ever before. Common sense also told us to preserve the peace. We'd have to become strong again after years of weakness and confusion. So we rebuild our defenses. Not only have the superpowers actually begun to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and hope for even more progress is bright. I never meant to go into politics. It wasn't my intention when I was young. But I was raised to believe you had to pay your way for the blessings bestowed on you. But back in the 1960s, when I began, it seemed to me that we'd begun reversing the order of things. That through more and more rules and regulations and confiscatory taxes, the government was taking more of our money, more of our options, and more of our freedom. I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do. From the father down the street who fought in Korea, or the family who lost someone in Anzio. So we've got to teach history.
Historian Evan Thomas said that Eisenhower looked to the future, whose goal was to disarm, to get rid of those terrible weapons. But at the same time, the West had to keep up its pressure on the communist bloc until communism collapsed from its own internal contradictions. I believe, and I believe I've proven, that Ronald Reagan, one of Eisenhower's protege, was actually his major political heir, and he directly completed Eisenhower's goals. Please read those details here. I'd like to end how I end. Reagan had taken to heart the inspiring 65 oration of Eisenhower, who had urged his fellow citizens to carry on the goals he had shared with Winston Churchill to free captive nations. And the Eisenhower and Reagan journey together had begun when Coach Eisenhower had mentored his new political student, all during Reagan's first campaign for the presidency. In the end, President Reagan would triumph in carrying forth the mantle of freedom that he had inherited from his heroes, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Winston Churchill, but most of all, Dwight Eisenhower. And I'd like to end with this official Ronald Reagan cabinet portrait photo showing President Reagan, Vice President Bush, under the watchful and I hope happy gaze of his mentor, Dwight Eisenhower. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that's a pretty convincing case, I would say, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, yeah. Got a hook on here. But I'm sure this is Washington, D.C. I see a few skeptics out there, maybe, or at least you want to learn more from this marvelous, as I say, citizen historian. So please, let's dive right into it. Who has some questions for our author? Yes.
Michael Barone with AEI and Washington Examiner. Is it your opinion that Eisenhower saw Reagan really more as his sort of heir, than some of the other Republican alternatives. You look at the 1960 campaign when he's still president, you've got Nixon, whom he seems to have not entirely trusted. You've got Nixon surrendering to Nelson Rockefeller at the Treaty of Fifth Avenue, and Eisenhower didn't trust Rockefeller at all and thought he was a dangerous character. I think that's fair to say. Do you think he really saw Reagan much more than Nixon or other Republicans as his heir?
Can you hear? I don't have a slide. I address this in a longer talk that I give. In my book, I detail a January '68 interview that Ike gave. I term it the golf buddy interview. A reporter met with Eisenhower's supposed golf buddy, which I believe was Eisenhower himself. If you read Professor Fred Greenstein's Hidden Hand Presidency book on Eisenhower, history characterizes that Eisenhower had press conferences where he went off on all these wild tangents, didn't make sense. It was all planned to throw the press off from what he was doing, and Greenstein's book clearly documents this. And I believe this was Eisenhower continuing that same sort of plausible deniability with this particular interview. And in it, he is asked, who do you think who should be the GOP nominee in '68? And he says clearly, the man most qualified is Richard Nixon, but I would like to see the party nominate someone who can win. And the person who just was the major new winner in '66 by almost 1 million votes in the nation's biggest state was Ronald Reagan. And I believe this was his subtle way of saying he hoped that Reagan would be the nominee. Now, eventually, before that convention, Nixon finally goes and asks for his support, and the two families are merging. David and Julie are about to get married, so what really can Ike do? He doesn't want a big family rift. Reagan, of course, had been running a stealth campaign, had not yet officially declared, even though a year earlier he said he was open to a draft. So he went with what choice there was, saying, yes, I will endorse Richard Nixon. But I think secretly he hoped that the convention would nominate Ronald Reagan. And if not then, I think he foresaw Reagan in the White House at some future point.
Yes, David. Wait for the mic, if you will. Thank you.
David Bowes from the Cato Institute. I guess what strikes me as surprising about all you're telling us is I'm almost old enough to remember the early conservative movement, which did not think highly of Dwight Eisenhower. Some conservatives thought he was a communist. Others thought that the whole point of the conservative movement was to restore the Republican Party to actually being opposed to the New Deal and bigger government, which they saw Eisenhower doing. So you seem to have presented evidence that Reagan didn't see it that way, unless Reagan was just being a crafty politician, because who wouldn't want to get in good with Dwight Eisenhower? And that Eisenhower apparently reacted very favorably to Reagan's sort of founding document of the modern conservative movement, his '64 speech. So I take it that's what your whole book is about, but it's a surprising story to me.
Part of it, you saw that record, Mr. Lincoln's Party Today. In it, Dwight Eisenhower tells his firm beliefs in republicanism, individual freedom, and small government. And he says that's the firm bedrock of modern republicanism, traced back to Abraham Lincoln and carried forth in our time, meaning the time of 1962. And when Reagan comes to his defense, when Buckley and he discuss it, he says that, you know, he didn't have a Congress of his own party. All he could do was use the veto. Reagan faced the same situation in Sacramento, to use that veto. So he couldn't, he tried his best to slow things down of the expansion of government in the 50s, but was hampered because he believed, Eisenhower and both Reagan believed firmly in the law. I think they would disapprove of a lot of executive action taken by a president in today's time and his predecessors of, I wouldn't say skirting around the law, but just through executive action, doing things that Congress had not approved. They staunchly believed in following the letter of the law, or if people could break the law whenever they wanted, society would fall apart.
For the benefit of the younger members in the audience, David mentions the conservatives who were talking about Ike being a commie. Well, of course, that was the John Birch Society, an extreme right-wing outfit, which was repudiated and kicked out of the conservative movement by Bill Buckley and National Review several years later. Now, it is true that Bill Buckley himself was skeptical about Eisenhower, to say the least, did not like modern republicanism and so forth. But Buckley never stooped to such silly things as to call Ike a commie. That was the special province of the John Birch Society, which is why they were kicked out of the movement. More questions, please, from this brilliant audience here. Me in the back row.
Hi, Frank Scaturo. I have a question about Mamie Eisenhower, who survived her husband by 10 years and, of course, lived to see Reagan become a major candidate in '76. Did you, in your research, encounter any interesting tidbits, either her views about Reagan during the stage or anything that would reflect further on her on the Reagan's relationship with her husband?
I did not, and please understand also that Eisenhower and Reagan did not talk about their relationship in any major way other than what I've been able to dig, and this was on one little segment of one of 66 tapes that I listened to from press conferences of that era, that the fact that he was that inspiration. He does not mention Eisenhower in his autobiography. He does not discuss Eisenhower, to my best knowledge, in the 80s. There are a few exceptions to that I'll mention briefly. But even discussing things with his campaign manager of '68, he said, no, this is all brand new information. He had over 100 meetings with Reagan planning that '68 campaign. Eisenhower never came up at all. They were completely unaware. And I could ask Mr. Meese if you have any recollections of President Reagan ever discussing things related to President Eisenhower. Okay.
Before you, this is important. Can we get a microphone here for Mr. Meese? Thank you.
I only remembered twice. He did. I do have a general recollection of some conversations in which he mentioned Eisenhower, but they're too specific. One was in '68, and I think that's the picture you have of him playing golf with Eisenhower. That was one time, and the other time was Eisenhower's funeral. He made a point of going to Eisenhower's funeral.
The 2 points I wanted to make, just in terms of policy, it has been mentioned to me through a third party that I've not been able to follow up on because I just learned of it the other day, that at one point President Reagan mentioned that he had been upset with how Eisenhower handled the Suez crisis in '56. Had I known of that, it would have, of course, been in my book, but I was not aware of that. But I do trace out the similarities and differences with Lebanon. Lebanon was an involvement of President Eisenhower in the '50s and, of course, President Reagan in the blowing up of the Marine barracks in the 1980s. And at one point, President Reagan does ask some of his assistants to pull out the files of how Ike handled Lebanon in the '50s. So I go over that in my book. But beyond that, just nothing at all. This is all me digging out their correspondence that has never been looked at before in Abilene, and those files are related to mainly through the Golf Buddy and letters back and forth between them, and then listening to all of these tapes, mainly of those press conferences, every time he traveled outside of Sacramento to Nebraska, to Wisconsin and Oregon, specifically the main three primary states he targeted in '68, and the growth of him in foreign affairs during those press conferences became, after Bobby Kennedy said he was going to run, 5 critically important white paper speeches that Ronald Reagan then delivered, and you heard an excerpt from one of those.
Yes, please, Fred. Wait a sec. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Fred Barnes with the Weekly Standard. Gene, why did other historians and journalists who've written extensively about Reagan and Eisenhower not discover this and write about their relationship? Did they just not go to Abilene to read all the documents there? Was it too far or what?
Good question. You'll have to ask others that. I got to this. My own story is, as you heard me reference, I wanted to write about and learn why he first ran for the presidency, and that was going to be the theme of my book. But in a book written by Chiron Skinner and the two Andersons, they make a little reference in a footnote that there's probably a little more information in the Eisenhower Library about Freeman Gosden, the golf buddy, and their relationship. And I sort of highlighted that, and then it was a couple of years later that I got around to doing this, and that's where I went. And to me, it was, the treasure trove of information outlining their correspondence. So unless someone knew to look at Freeman Gosden at the Eisenhower Library, it would have been missed.
Have other historians and journalists gone to Abilene, to that library? You must know who's been there.
Other historians have referenced two of their letters, and the Weekly Standard about 6 months ago, two historians from the Hudson Institute went over one of their letters. But beyond that, all the documents that you saw, there are about close to 30 specific documents altogether. The first.
Now, Fred, if you had your choice of going to Abilene, Kansas, or going to Southern California, where would you go?
Well, I've been to the Nixon libraries and the Reagan ones, but I haven't been to Abilene.
Well, neither, as a matter of fact, I remember Ann and I went there once, but we were looking at a book about somebody else than what we're talking about here today, and we just never had the brains to do what Gene has done. I mean, it's just amazing. All of these hotshot historians, we blew it, guys. We really did blow it.
Thank you for your kind words.
Please. Here's right here, sir.
Wayne Schroeder, Institute of World Politics. You've got Bobby Kennedy's photo on the front of your book. And in 1968, it was still quite uncertain as to who the Democratic nominee was going to be in the fall of '67 and as we went into early '68. And when Bobby Kennedy got in, clearly that was sent a real blow, I think, to many people on the Republican side, because he's a very charismatic figure, very much like his brother. And so the thought that Nixon would have to go up against Bobby Kennedy could have been very problematic, Nixon not being as charismatic, but Reagan certainly was. Did you come across anything in your book about that relationship?
Of course, as I mentioned, I have no time today to show those slides. However, I go into their relationship in much detail. Lee mentioned some of their beginning relationship, the Screen Actors Guild, MCA, testimony that Reagan was forced to give. Bobby Kennedy arranged that testimony was moved to Hollywood. And Michael Reagan tells the story that it was Bobby Kennedy who coerced GE to cancel the show. Reagan was left then unemployed. And had Bobby not done that, who knows, maybe even to this day, every Sunday evening, we'd see Ronald Reagan as the host of General Electric Theater. Never would have entered politics. But there's much more. They meet face-to-face for the first time in February of '67 in Washington, D.C. at the Gridiron Club. And it's a political stunt evening of fun. Bobby bests California Ronald Reagan clearly. And I detail all this in my book. But 3 months later, CBS holds another in their series of Town Meeting of the World international debates. The first was in '65, when they get Henry Kissinger and a bunch of Harvard professors to sign a petition wanting to win the war in Vietnam. Ike actually has a copy of that in his library. Flash forward to '67. CBS chooses Ronald Reagan to be the Republican representative for an internationally televised and run debate. The way it worked is there's a group of students sitting in Oxford University, all Oxford students. The theme is America's image in the world. On the Democrat side, in a studio in Washington, is Robert Kennedy. In Sacramento is Republican Ronald Reagan. Richard Nixon is very annoyed that Reagan is chosen. But regardless, Reagan is there now as the party spokesman on the main hotspot of the time, Vietnam. He studies and studies. This is shortly after one of his meetings about Vietnam with Eisenhower. During this debate, which you can watch on YouTube, but my book goes over a lot of detail, he trounces Bobby Kennedy in that debate. The students mercilessly ask questions, just attacking America left and right. There's one American student in that audience, a young Princeton basketball star who's there on his Rhodes Scholarship, guy by the name of Bill Bradley. Well, I called former Senator Bradley and I said, Senator, I'm writing this story. Has anyone ever interviewed you before on your recollections of the Reagan-Kennedy debate? Senator Bradley says, Gene, until you just did, nobody ever has. So you'll read what Senator Bradley's recollections are of that debate. Reagan knew all of his facts left and right. All Bobby Kennedy does is sort of sit there lamely apologizing for America after apology. It was not the apology tour, it was the apology studio debate. Ethel Kennedy at her home is yelling at her TV, Bobby, he's killing you, you got to do something. The press, all the liberal press included, says Ronald Reagan trounced Bobby Kennedy. The GOP establishment, grassroots say to themselves, you know, a year from now, we don't want another Nixon-Kennedy debate if Kennedy happens to be the nominee. Here we have a guy who's a great communicator. He just won the governorship of California by almost 1 million votes. He's just defeated Bobby Kennedy. We want Ronald Reagan to be our nominee. And that was the inspiration for many, many grassroots activists. Flash forward now to the spring of '68. Once I go into the details, Reagan's campaign is having some hard times. When Bobby Kennedy announces he's going to be a candidate, this reinvigorates Reagan. He reasserts himself. He gets in a new speechwriter. He starts to write these 5 white paper speeches, not only attacking the Kennedy-Johnson era, but tying Bobby Kennedy, who at first in the early 60s wanted to win in Vietnam, as did JFK, now to saying, well, I don't want to. Well, where did he change his mind? What do you not want to have? You don't want to help people seeking freedom? He ties Bobby Kennedy, using some of their own words, to those changes in policy, culminating in speeches in Cleveland and Amarillo.
Terrific. If I could do a follow-up there. Now, Ed, I don't know if you'd be willing to speculate a little bit or to share with us how serious was Ronald Reagan about running for the president? I mean, you were there, and I know there is some...
And Ed's comments are in my book, that he was... I don't want to put words in Ed's mouth. Let him speak for himself.
Go further, then you can come back.
Okay.
But to get that kind of insight, because there's some people who say, oh, well, it was 11th hour.
Right.
He wasn't really serious about it. Other people say, including Tom, what's his name? Tom Reed, that, oh, it was planned from the beginning. And so if you could give us your insight into that.
Well, Tom Reed was serious about him running for president. There were 3 different campaigns running for president. One was Tom Reed, and he was at that time the Republican National Committeeman from California. He had been in the Reagan capital in Sacramento in the Reagan staff for about 5 months at the beginning of his 1967 governorship, and then handled all of Ronald Reagan's major political affairs from that point on. And in a sense, and then there were 2 others. There was a fellow who had Citizens for Reagan, whose name escapes me right now, but I think he was in Kansas City or someplace like that.
Henry A. Bubb.
Henry Bubb, right, exactly. And then there was the kitchen cabinet, and they were pretty much in favor of him, and they hired a gentleman from New York who had worked for Rockefeller, Cliff White. And so you had these three different campaigns all going and not working together at all. So you could say there was a somewhat disorganized campaign. Ronald Reagan himself was ambivalent. He never really believed, he said afterwards, that he was running for president. He was running as a favorite son. And of course, that was his principal reason for running, was he had brought the Republican Party together after it had been totally decimated in 1958 by William F. Nolan, who was a senator at that time, and he decided he'd never become president from the Senate, but that he could if he was governor of California. So he persuaded Goodwin Knight to change places with him, and he ran for governor of California in '58. Goodwin Knight was then persuaded to run for senator. They both lost, and Republicans lost everything. Ronald Reagan in 1966 brought them together, and he followed the advice that was mentioned earlier about bringing Christopher's people together. He had actually, in '66, left spaces in his campaign organization open until after the primary, and he brought all of Christopher's people in. Some of them became members of the kitchen cabinet and were very active from that point on. Yeah. In any event, he was determined not to have a Rockefeller-Nixon, Rockefeller-Goldwater situation with Nixon taking Goldwater's place, dividing the party in California. So his rationale to himself was that he was a favorite son candidate. At the same time, as Tom Reed will say, he did all the things necessary and gave all the encouragement to Tom to go ahead with the campaign. So if you would ask Ronald Reagan, was he really running for president, he would say no. If you asked Tom Reed or anybody else who was close to him, they would say yes. And so that was kind of his, if you will, a split personality on the subject of running. But in actuality, he gave the speeches and that sort of thing. And so I think in his subconscious mind, he wanted to be ready should the call come. Right. Now, the call didn't come really, although he was nominated. And the reason he was nominated was the same Bill Nolan, who was still active in the Republican Party, and many of the conservatives were very much afraid that if Nixon lost on the first ballot, that Rockefeller would step in. And so that's why at the convention in 1968, Nolan persuaded Ronald Reagan to have his name put into nominations. So both from a technical standpoint and a practical standpoint, he did in fact run in '68. But as I say, if you were here today and you asked him, he said, well, I wasn't really running.
Gene, did you
Oh, I obviously I can't disagree with any of that. I would just say that my multiple interviews with Mr. Reed, he's documented the more than 100 meetings they had, beginning with the first four within weeks of November '66, planning that campaign. It was going to be a stealth campaign. He couldn't start running for president. He didn't even begin serving yet as governor. But his entire travel schedule of many, many weekends, leaving Sacramento, seeking to build up his delegates. He built his Oregon team, Nebraska, his Wisconsin teams on those visits, seeking financial support from Boeing and Coors and many, many others, Maytag. That's what I document in there. And Cliff White was out seeking delegates. And at the governor's conference in June of '67 is when he told the press for the first time, and it sent shockwaves out there, that if they come calling, want to draft me, I'm open for a draft. And it continued. But anytime the press would say, you know, are you a candidate? No. He would constantly deny it. But they actually, between the two, Reed and Reagan, had a definite date that they wanted to declare, the beginning of the convention. They hoped that the original plans were to stick his head above the water in Wisconsin, which he did. There were three unique primaries. I can get into it in more detail. Wisconsin, he wins 11% of the vote, a little less. Nebraska, 22%. And then the original plans were to win Oregon. He was going to win California as favorite son and to sail into Miami Beach with this alternative to Nixon and become the nominee. Well, in Oregon, he doesn't do any better than he does in Nebraska, and I think part of the problem was, even though he visited Oregon 3 times in '67, he doesn't at all in '68. He has a meeting with his grassroots activists in Idaho, but he never goes to Oregon to drum up local enthusiasm. And there's only so much enthusiasm these Reagan offices can build up with an absentee candidate. And that's, of course, a major fault with the campaign. But he learned those lessons, as well as the lessons of '76 for 1980.
I think an interesting sidelight to this is the fact that that those of us who were in the governor's staff were divided on the subject. There were some who were favored his running. There were a couple of us, Bill Clark and myself, who were very much opposed to it. And so I think that was part of his, you point out the fact that all of his campaigning was done on weekends because he was very assiduous in not wanting to do anything that people could say that he was neglecting his job as governor. And so literally he was moonlighting as a candidate while still as the governor.
And of course, Attorney General, you're in here, of course, along with those other people as well, as the anti.
Just a minor correction, Ed. You said that Cliff White had worked for Nelson Rockefeller. Actually, he, of course, had been our main delegate hunter for Barry Goldwater in 1964. So Cliff was quite a genius at political organizing.
He worked for Rockefeller, too.
Worked for Nixon, for Dewey. I'm not sure. I'm not. Yeah.
Rockefeller. He was the director of motor vehicles in New York when Rockefeller
Right.
was
Right. Yeah, right. Not as a political manager though, Randy.
And the Cliff White archives at Cornell University have nothing on 1968, not a shred of paper.
Really, that's amazing. Yeah, Randy.
Well, I realize we're running out of time, so I'll try to.
No, we got time. How much more time do we have?
No one here has authorized me to say this, but the Students for Reagan campaign on the back row here has authorized me to just thank you so much for having done this book. You know, you look at
You're
books
welcome.
about various political figures, and somebody simply has figured out how to write in a different way what has already been written, and the contribution you have made here in bringing this new information to light is of tremendous value, I think, in presidential history, whether the Reagan Library ever realizes that or not.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Then raises the question as to, since the publication of the book, have you, in defense of Kansas, which my family, I'm obligated to do here, have you had any response from the Eisenhower Library in respect to the book? And then let me just make an observation. Lee has mentioned Robert Welch's views of Eisenhower, and to those of us, and it's probably everybody in this room, that has been to Gettysburg, he misunderstood that the observation that Mamie had never liked anything in her life unless it was pink.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the Eisenhower question. Actually, they were the first place that I spoke last October. As soon as Tim Rives, the director there, heard of my work, he immediately invited me to speak, and I was very nicely and warmly received, as the Hoover Institution and Heritage Foundation. I'll just, you'll provide your shoulders. The Ronald Reagan Library has been most uninterested, unreceptive, and I just knocked my head against the wall. They don't want to have me as a speaker. Even to have the book in their gift shop has now taken 6 weeks for them to even decide that. I don't know how I offended them, or maybe it's nothing. I just don't know. If any of you can be of help, please do. I'd love to speak there, but they just are uninterested, which shocks me. I've tried there. They have also said it's not really about Nixon, so no.
But the Reagan Branch Library and gift shop, I'm sure,
Andy Coffin there is going to have it in the gift shop and hopefully at some point be a speaker.
Well, we still have time left, so if we have more questions out there, please. Yes, we've already had you once, David. We'll give it back to you. Anybody else want to go first, and we'll come back to David? Anybody else? No? Yes, yeah, Ron.
I think Russell Kirk may have had the best line on Dwight Eisenhower versus Robert Welch, and that was, the late Russell Kirk, Ike's not a communist, he's a golfer.
Very cute.
David.
Thanks. I noticed when you put up the list of candidates that Ike wanted to have lunch with, or was it with him, the lunch? Scranton wasn't mentioned, his own governor, and I was thinking, wasn't Scranton a candidate? I guess maybe after '64, Scranton got kind of disillusioned with politics and left, but I wonder, did you find out anything? What did Ike think of his own governor, Scranton?
Not something I explored, but let me pick up at the beginning of your thought. The question has been asked of me, well, maybe, Ike's mentoring of Reagan was just something that he did to any rising other Republican. So I looked through the files on those other names, Percy, Hatfield, Rockefeller. Rockefeller, he had one correspondence with good luck in the election, but nothing like this, nothing other than it was Ronald Reagan, through friends or directly, who he was clearly mentoring. There was nothing like this, Percy, Hatfield, or others. It was a direct, specific Eisenhower, a mentorship of just Ronald Reagan.
I'll just offer a little bit. Oh, yes, please, Gil.
I just remembered something while you were talking. Gil Robinson, I was the youngest appointee of Eisenhower, and very grateful to have served in both of those administrations. But I was thinking of the first time that Governor Reagan, and Ed, you might remember this, came to New York, and he had a speech at one of the hotels, and he invited most of the people who were involved in politics, Bill Casey, Bill Sapphire, myself, a lot of others. And in that speech, he stood there for at least an hour more, an hour and 15 minutes without notes. And in this speech, I remember that he referred at one point to Ike. And of course, I was most interested in that, and I was very grateful to be asked to come in by him to his administration.
I just offer one little bit of brief corroboration about the time for choosing speech by Ronald Reagan in October of 1964, that General Eisenhower called down to a senior operative at the National Committee, Ab Herman, and said, that was a terrific speech, I'd like a print. And so we arranged for a print of that speech to be sent to the general. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it just seems to me here is a not only a wonderful book, but a really terrific lecturer. He knows this material. Q&A is fantastic. And again, it seems to me it shows you don't have to be a so-called professional to come up with some good information and new information about one of the most talked about and written about presidents in American history. So please join me in